Hello, I'm Steve Satterfield. Welcome to the Proposal Defense presentation. This presentation, coming to you by way of YouTube, thanks to the quarantine and the coronavirus, is intended to be phase one of the defense, with phase two intended to be a follow-up WebEx meeting that we will schedule at your convenience after you've had a chance to view this presentation, to view the supplementary video that will focus on demonstrating the web application in greater detail, and I've had a chance to read the actual proposal paper. The project is entitled Removing a Potential Barrier to Lifelong Learning by Reducing Extrinsic Cognitive Load in the Course Selection Process, a feasibility study. Let's start with a look at lifelong learning. What does the term mean? Informal lifelong learning is nothing new. Children have always learned to play games from each other outside of any formal instruction and primarily without any adult involvement. And they learn to ride bicycles. Adults learn to cook new dishes or even to re-examine and modify old belief systems in light of new evidence. Lifelong learning has been a much used phrase over the past few decades. So where did the current usage originate? Probably the two events that were most responsible for solidifying the current popular use of the phrase were the publication of the Fourier Report, 1972, and the Delors Report, 1996. These two reports were the result of UNESCO, the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, UNESCO commissions that were brought together to study education from a global perspective. Both reports recommended that education should be lifelong. And the Delors Report took the idea a step further and recommended that education should not only be lifelong, but as someone else later put it, life-wide. They described four pillars of education, and those four pillars were learning to know, learning to be, learning to do, and learning to live together. Now, learning to know, that's just learning so for the sake of increasing your knowledge. Learning to do might be learning a skill, learning something practical. Learning to be is generally considered to be just learning to be a better person among your fellow men. And learning to live together, well, that's pretty straightforward. And they went on to say that at every phase of life, people should be learning something from each of these four pillars. So you wouldn't just focus in youth on learning to know, and then in early adulthood on learning to do, and etc. You should be learning something from each pillar all the time. The lifelong learning envisioned by the UNESCO Commission encompasses both formal and informal learning. Universities and community colleges should no longer primarily be serving just the traditional college-age student, but should have strong continuing education programs and leisure learning programs for senior citizens. The Delors recommendation about the four pillars being important at every phase of life suggests that some of the types of content now found primarily in the leisure learning programs for senior citizens should be worked into programs that target other age groups as well. Their primary aim, the UNESCO commissions, was to enable a worldwide democratic society, establish unifying principles among nations, increase dignity and respect within and among nations by promoting educational opportunities for more and more people, and thereby to promote understanding among nations and reduce the chances of international conflict. It's worth noting that among the members of the Fourier Commission were people who had experienced the fruits of international conflict firsthand during the Second World War. So it wasn't necessarily just an academic exercise to some of these people. After these reports were published and the concept of lifelong learning entered popular culture, some more utilitarian justifications emerged. And these have to do with the rapid expansion of human knowledge, or the shrinking half-life of knowledge as it becomes obsolete more quickly as new knowledge emerges. The shrinking pool of younger adults to support the growing population of senior citizens, or the potential support ratio, the PSR, and the increasing speed of major societal and technological change. Here we see a timeline of the doubling time of human knowledge, or the quantity of data and information over the years. It took over 400 years for the quantity of human knowledge to double between 1440 and 1900. 1900 hasn't been that long ago. My grandfather was born in 1902. I knew him quite well for many years. In the scheme of things, it's been a very short time since 1900, when we were at the tail end of a time when it was taking 400 years for knowledge, human knowledge, to double in quantity. Now, if you look at the projection for 2020, as you can see, it picked up speed over the 20th century, and by 2017, when this graphic was drawn, it was doubling at the rate of every 13 months, and it was projected at that time in an IBM study based on the projection of the build out of the Internet of Things, that quantity of data and information would be doubling at the rate of every 12 hours. Here we see some timelines of major societal change in the United States from 1787 to 2015. Now let's just look quickly at two of these, similar in that they both relate to marriage. But one of them took nearly 200 years to become accepted, and the other, more recent major change, took about 8 years. And these are interracial marriage. The initial trigger event starts on this timeline in 1787 and ends only in 1967 with the Supreme Court ruling that prohibited states from denying anyone the right to marry based on being of different races. Now, if you look at same-sex marriage, the trigger event probably around 2006 during the George W. Bush administration, and then before the end of the very next presidency, the Obama administration, it had been settled in the Supreme Court. So it took nearly 200 years for our society to fully accept something that for many, if not most people today, is a non-issue. Something that had been accepted, in fact, in earlier societies, almost a uniquely American taboo. Then, just a few years ago, a push for allowing same-sex couples to marry led to nationwide acceptance within just about 8 years. And there seems to be very little pushback on this, probably nothing compared to what interracial couples have experienced in our nation's history. These two factors alone, the rapid speed at which knowledge becomes obsolete and the rapid changes in what is and is not accepted in society, make it imperative that people, older people especially, continue to learn and to understand the changes going on around us. Otherwise, we run the risk of perceiving ourselves to be cut off from society, as it might be seen as something very foreign to us. Social isolation has been shown in study after study to be to cause to be correlated with physical and cognitive issues and this is in different organisms, rats up to humans, and but in quite a few studies, it's been shown that just the perception of social isolation is actually a stronger predictor of someone being having such physical and cognitive issues in store. It's a stronger predictor than the actual number of social connections. So if people, even though an individual may have the same number of social connections as before, if people perceive themselves to be socially isolated, then they may begin to have these physical and cognitive difficulties. The shrinking potential support ratio, or the PSR, is one of the motivations for lifelong formal and informal learning, as the over 65 population faces a trend toward fewer and fewer younger adults to potentially step up and support us. The PSR is the number of late adolescents and younger adults to every person over the age of 65. Globally, it was 12 to 1 in 1950. Here we see that in 2015 in the United States, the PSR was only 4 to 1. 4 persons between the ages of 15 to 64 to every one person over the age of 65. And here we see that in the developed world, the wealthier countries that have the highest percentages of older people, the PSR is projected to be 2 to 1 by 2050. So we're entering an era in human history when we as senior citizens may have to pull our own weight much later into old age than our parents and grandparents needed to do. The nation may not be able to sustain the social and economic safety nets that we currently see. Now here are some age distribution comparisons from the United States. A look at 1930 versus the projections for 2030. The age distributions seem to be flattening out. I remember as a teenager in the 1960s, we heard a lot about the Malthusian theory of exponential population growth versus an arithmetic growth in the food supply. And that was an argument for why we must get to zero population growth. And if you look at 2030's projection, this may be what it looks like. Another incentive for learning and growing throughout life is the development and sustainment of self-esteem. According to this curve, it seems to peak around age 51 for the most part, and then declines sharply at age 60, starting at age 60. Now, this is on average. This probably applies less to the people in this audience, as we are all, by definition, lifelong learners. But the onset of physical frailty and the retirement or partial retirement into a different income bracket or socioeconomic category will still take its toll on self-esteem. We can, however, alleviate the additional factor that many in our age group face of finding themselves with outdated skills and the perception of being left behind by rapid societal and technological change. Therefore, an underlying premise or assumption of this study is that lifelong learning, for multiple reasons, is not only a desirable goal, but also an essential fact of modern life. There simply is no desirable alternative. Researchers have identified several types of barriers to lifelong learning. Attitudinal barriers might include a lack of confidence in one's ability to learn something new. Possibly there's a bad memory of an attempt to learn in the past, or an unwillingness to commit time and resources. That would be an attitudinal or dispositional barrier. Physical or material barriers might include such things as a prohibitively high cost associated with formal education, or perhaps the individual lives too far from a community college or university. Or maybe the individual lives in an area that doesn't have broadband internet and so cannot sign up for online learning. Or maybe the person lives in an area that has broadband available, but the person simply can't afford it. Structural or institutional barriers might be the result of local colleges or universities that don't offer continuing education or leisure learning programs. Informational barriers may be the result of information that is not readily available or not obviously available, or that is available in such a way that accessing it takes what is perceived by the individual as too much of a commitment of time and resources. In this study, I hypothesized that a combination of two different types of barriers, a dispositional barrier and an information barrier, combine into a single barrier to lifelong learning, and that the dynamics between the two are such that if it is possible to reduce the informational barrier component, then the dispositional barrier may no longer apply. The theoretical frameworks that inform this study are lifespan theory, andragogy, cognitive load theory, and e-learning theory. Now let's take a look at each of them in some detail. But first, it would be helpful if we can examine, when we examine lifespan theory and cognitive load theory, if we have first familiarized ourselves with how memory works. Or refamiliarized, I'm sure. Here we see a model of memory adapted from Atkinson and Shiffrin in 1968. Now this is a commonly accepted model of memory. Here we see inputs coming into working memory from sensory registers as well as from long-term memory. And note the finite capacity of working memory. On average, the individual can manage only 7, give or take 2, chunks of information concurrently within working memory. And the important point about what constitutes a chunk of information in working memory is that it is highly variable. For example, if you're trying to incorporate a new telephone number into long-term memory, the phone number minus the area code is 7 digits, and so each individual digit would be a chunk of information in working memory in that case. However, if you're trying to learn something new about a theoretical framework and it reminds you of something you already know within that framework or a different framework, then you will retrieve the entire schema for a theoretical framework from long-term memory and bring it into working memory as a single chunk of information. The lifespan theory, Baltus and Baltus, describes human development as a lifelong process. Moreover, human development happens in multiple dimensions, socially and emotionally, cognitively and biologically, with gains and losses at every phase of development, young and old. Plasticity is the ability to adapt from the lowest level of the neuron up to the behaviors of the complete individual, all the way up to human society. Adaptation occurs at each of those levels. At the neuronal level, When one region of the brain suffers an impairment, whether from physical trauma or early stages of dementia, other regions of the brain can step up and take on some of the functionality previously handled by the damaged region. Also, even in the healthy, cognitively unimpaired individual, if an area of the brain needs additional horsepower due to above average demands placed on the functionality provided by that region, then neurogenesis, the generation of new nervous system cells or neurons from neural stem cells, will provide the extra density and the additional synapses and connections to meet those demands. A well-known study cited in the paper found that an examination of the hippocampal region of the brains of London cab drivers shows greater than average size. And the hypothesis is that the hippocampal region, believed to be involved in spatial reasoning and navigational skills, grows itself to meet the demands of years of acquiring a detailed mental map of London. Behavioral plasticity is any willful act or process initiated by the individual for the purpose of changing or adapting in response to a biological or sociocultural influence or some internal motivation to change. Societal plasticity is generally described in terms of constraints on the individual within society. Some of these constraints, unfortunately, may be legally or culturally imposed, but others may be simply the result of the individual's responses to societal influences or the habits of the individual. There are also interactions between social and behavioral influences and neuronal plasticity. Davidson and McEwen, 2012, describe examples from rats to humans indicating that an enriched social environment as well as daily physical activity will stimulate neurogenesis. Lifespan theory also accounts for human development within historical and cultural context. Biocultural co-constructivism, we shall see illustrated on the next slide, but essentially it's the assertion that the individual's development is due not only to biological, social, and cultural influences, but also on how the individual responds to those influences and the decisions made in response. Selective optimization with compensation suggests that as we get older, we tend to be more selective in how we expend resources, including time. We might have fewer but better friendships, for example. The compensation part comes into play when the elderly individual chooses, for example, to listen to more books on audible.com than to spend the time reading because of declining eyesight. Plus, and here's the optimization part, they realize possibly that they can accomplish a nice healthy walk while hearing the book being read to them. So they can accomplish two things at once: optimize their time while compensating for failing eyesight. And as we get older, that seems to be a much more sought after pattern. Selective optimization with compensation. And the main takeaway for the purposes of this study with selective optimization with compensation is that if some desirable activity is deemed as too costly in terms of time or other resources, then the elderly individual may simply choose not to do it. Here we have an illustration of biocultural co-constructivism. with a bit of William James thrown in habit. The largest circle is the sphere of the individual and what is under their control. In this sphere we see behavioral plasticity, willful acts, and so by definition under the control of the individual. And we see decisions and responses to external influences. And we see habit. William James described habit as the great flywheel of society, something that keeps the individual within a particular orbit in society. The difficulty of breaking out of this orbit may be regarded as societal plasticity, but habit may be the individual's mechanism of control for breaking through this type of societal constraint in the absence of legal or cultural constraints on the individual. The biological and sociocultural spheres impinge on the individual sphere, and there is some interaction, but the individual in most cases has the largest role. Gains and losses occur at every phase of development. Here are some striking examples of gains accompanied by losses very early in life, as well as an example from old age. Very early in life, around age 2, sort of as a toddler, the brain matures to the point that the individual gains the capacity to process language and to apply a verbal narrative to day-to-day experiences. The individual then transitions from the sensory encoding of day-to-day experiences into long-term memory to verbally encoding these experiences into long-term memory. And this gain is accompanied by the eventual loss of the ability to retrieve the earlier sensory encoded memories. Then in adolescence, the brain matures to the point that the individual gains the ability to foresee better the consequences of a contemplated action or behavior. However, it can be demonstrated that there is an accompanying loss of some speed of reaction time. And then in old age, the individual will typically lose some working memory capacity. However, the older adult will have gained over a lifetime a rich store of memory schemas, and so will be able to more efficiently utilize working memory. Now, if you remember back, this is why I wanted to show you the slide first to refamiliarize with how memory works, because if you recall that slide, a chunk of information can be a very complex object, a very complex schema, and the complexity of your stores of information in long-term memory is certainly a direct product of your level of education and learning. So that's another great argument for lifelong learning is we can more efficiently utilize working memory, and as it begins to diminish in capacity, theoretically we should be impacted a bit less. Control processes, primary versus secondary. This is another major tenet of lifespan theory. The primary control process is when the individual is changing the environment to meet their own needs or desires, and the secondary control process is the individual is changing themselves to adapt to the needs of the environment. Primary control is generally the preferred process. Baltus cautions that the attempt by many aging adults to maintain the primary control process by proxy further into old age is a threat to independence, because the older adult may surrender some autonomy in exchange for having a younger person exert primary control over their environment on their behalf. Lifelong education and learning and maintaining as long as possible a fitness routine into old age may offer a better alternative to maintaining the primary control process. We cannot control what we don't understand. I may still dislike the music when I turn on the radio these days, and I may disagree with the commentary when I switch it over to NPR, but if I understand the history and the issues that led to these current states of affairs, then I may feel at least capable of becoming involved in a dialogue that may somehow impact society. Finally, lifespan theory suggests that as we age, our goal orientation shifts from being motivated primarily by growth to one of maintenance and prevention of loss. Now, continuing to learn and to educate oneself throughout life will help to keep growth as a motivating factor. Andragogy. Malcolm Knowles developed the educational paradigm of andragogy in response to some observations of his own and those of one of his mentors, Alfred North Whitehead, the philosopher. Knowles studied educational journal articles from the 1920s through 1948 and noted that as adult education became more and more common, there were quite a few articles from that era in which educators concluded that pedagogy was not applicable to the adult learner, and then described rather guiltily their improvisations to circumvent the shortcomings of pedagogy. Knowles also noted that his mentor, Whitehead, had observed that one of the major tenets of pedagogy was the goal of transferring to the learner a body of knowledge that had stood the test of time. Whitehead suggested that this goal was only appropriate when the time for major social and technological change was greater than the average human lifespan. By the early 20th century, this was no longer the case, and so a new educational paradigm was called for. That was Whitehead's contention. And as we saw in previous slides, fundamental societal changes can happen now within less than a decade, and major technological change happens in a matter of days. While the average human lifespan may be around 75 years, if you contrast that with the era of Socrates in the West and Confucius in the East, when pedagogy was born, and when society and certainly technology changed very little in the course of the average human lifespan, you may begin to see Whitehead's argument. Here we see an illustration of one of the major differences in pedagogy and andragogy. Pedagogy is content-centered, and the content is pushed out to the learner, and in andragogy, learning is problem-centered, with the learner in the center of it all, directing the learning experience and seeking out both content and instruction. Now note the two-way arrows from the learner to the content as the learner becomes a more integral part of the process and begins to contribute back to the content. The only point on this slide not covered by the illustration we just saw is that for the adult learner there is a recognition in andragogy that previous life experiences are a resource for the learner. On to cognitive load theory. There are three types of cognitive load. Extraneous cognitive load is just noise. It contributes nothing to the learning task or the learning goals, and it is simply an artifact of the way that the learning task has been designed. It should always be a goal when designing a learning task to minimize extraneous cognitive load. Germane cognitive load. This describes the sum of the mental processes that must come into play to accomplish the learning task. If you think back to that memory model, how much of working memory needs to be utilized to accomplish the task, how many chunks of information need to come from long-term memory, that sort of thing. Intrinsic cognitive load. Now this is the payload. This relates directly to the complexity of the learning task. A major tenet of cognitive load theory is that we have a finite capacity within working memory, and we saw that on the model of memory. Remember the 7 plus or minus 2 chunks of information that can be managed concurrently in working memory. I believe that comes from a paper by Miller in 1957. E-learning theory was developed from andragogy, cognitive load theory, and lifespan theory, and it is all about the application of technology to facilitate educational goals. An important thing to note is that e-learning theory is built on an awareness that human learning can only be enhanced by technology, not changed, and that it is the educational goals that drive the technology, not the reverse. E-learning theory suggests that we can use technology to modify and optimize the presentation of information to the learner and reduce extraneous cognitive load. And that is the intention of this study, to use technology to present the learning outcomes stated in course descriptions in the course catalog in an upfront manner, so that the potential student can view and select the available learning outcomes, and only then be presented with a recommended set of courses based on the learning outcomes that they have selected. Now, just a brief demo of the application. Here is the web application that I developed for this experiment, and I encourage you to go there, scholasticity.org. Pay no attention to this URL showing here. You'll be redirected to where it's physically hosted on Heroku, but this is my domain is scholasticity.org, and I encourage you to go there. And I believe I've emailed each of you a user account that you can use to authenticate in when it says log in with Google. You don't have to use your own accounts to go in, and neither will the research participants. I don't want to know who people are. I just need to be able to keep people separate so the recommendations go to the right people. Anyway, I've produced a supplemental video that goes into the makeup of the system in more detail, but here's how the student will be able to select a set of learning outcomes, and these will have been extracted from the course descriptions and the course catalog, and then the person would receive a set of recommendations. Excuse me. First, on the menu, you select the planner. And then expand one of the knowledge areas. Let's go with history and current affairs. And as you can see, there are lots of learning outcomes here that were pulled directly from the course descriptions in the course catalog from the fall catalog from Leisure Learning, fall 2019. Excuse me. So after you expand the knowledge area and you can read through these learning outcomes, let's see, if you don't find one here, then you can go to a different place, a different knowledge area. Let's just pick this one. So as soon as you check the box in the background under the hood, the recommendation has already been made and put onto your recommendation page. So let's go there. And here it is. And notice it said based on your selection of and describe how Mozart transformed opera, etc., etc. Now, when you click on the recommendation, you are going to be asked to rate it. See this Likert type rating scale here. And the question is, this recommendation fits with a desired learning outcome, and your responses can range from strongly disagree to strongly agree. So let's say we agree. Let's say we strongly agree. And I'll talk more about maintain and portfolio in the supplementary video. But the thing is, if you don't maintain, if you do like the recommendation and you intend to sign up for the course, then the intention is you would just check maintain and portfolio before you save it, and then it would disappear from the recommendations page and it would go to your portfolio page. But we're going to see all of that in the other video, the supplementary video. You're going to see all of this in much more detail. Well, let's go ahead and save it. And here it is. So at this point, if you like the recommendation, the student could simply call or go to the Leisure Learning Center website and register for the course. The student may want to check the maintain and portfolio, as I said, to move the recommendation into the portfolio first. Otherwise, if the student goes back into the planner and unchecks the box beside the selected learning outcome that led to this recommendation, then the recommendation would disappear. I would still have a record of the recommendation and the rating assigned by the user in the database for research purposes, but the end user would no longer see the recommendation. That's why I created the portfolio page and the ability to move it into the portfolio. So since I've talked so much about that, let's just do that. And by the way, here is this little face you see here that's so happy. That's because I rated it as strongly agree. In other words, it's just a quick indication it's another effort actually to reduce extraneous cognitive load here, because if I don't, let's say I don't put it in the portfolio just yet, and I come back in tomorrow and I think, okay, I want to, all the recommendations I was pretty happy with, I want to move them into the portfolio, and then I'll go and sign up for those courses. Well, this will tell you right away how you rated it. So let's go and change it to just agree, and we'll save it again. Now notice the face changes to, it's still a happy face. It's certainly not an unhappy face, but it's not laughing. It's not just extremely happy. It's pretty happy with the recommendation. So you can quickly see visually how you felt about the recommendation when you first saw it, when you go back in. So let's change it back, and let's save it in the portfolio. Now notice it disappeared from the recommendation page. So if we go to the portfolio, it's here. So that's all I want to show you at this point. Just to follow up on the slide where I described verbally what I intended to do so that the student doesn't have to get the course catalog, read through a lot of course descriptions, figure out for themselves, okay, what can I learn from each of these courses? It's stated in an upfront manner in the planner page of this web application, and these learning outcomes are all pulled directly from the course descriptions, and the person can just look at them, say, yes, I'd like to learn this and this and this, check the boxes, and then then they can read the course description for just those courses that they've already pre-selected based on an upfront presentation of just the learning outcomes. Now, a word about site selection. In addition to the obvious advantage of proximity, the University of West Florida Leisure Learning Program has a lot to recommend it as a site for a lifelong learning study of this type. Each member, averaging an age from 65 to 75 according to the director, is by definition a lifelong learner by the fact that we're still signing up for formal classes as senior citizens. In addition, Leisure Learning offers an eclectic mix of courses such that it's a good example of the concept that people should be learning something from each of the four pillars. And here we see the de facto catchment area for the UWF Leisure Learning Program. In 2019, all but 4 of the 459 members of Leisure Learning who signed up for courses came from zip codes within these 4 counties. And that's Escambia, Santa Rosa, and Okaloosa in Florida, and then Baldwin County, Alabama. So that would seem to be the primary catchment area for our Leisure Learning Program. Those 4 outliers I mentioned who didn't come from zip codes in those 4 counties reported zip codes in far distant states, Kansas, Nevada, Minnesota, and Arkansas. So possibly they were just new to the area and were reporting a previous permanent address, but at any rate they were extreme outliers and weren't taken into consideration when figuring out where people typically come from. Now, if you access the U.S. Census data from 2010 and add up the figures from each of those 4 counties in our catchment area, here's what you get. A total of 812,078 population in 2010 in the 4-county region. 140,332 of those were over the age of 65, and 505,794 between the ages of 18 to 64. Now, if you do the math, this yields a PSR at that time of about 3.6 to 1. But if you recall on those other slides we were looking at with regard to the PSR, most people work with an age range of 15 to 64 to figure out the PSR. So if we were to make that adjustment, I'm sure that in 2010 we would have been over the 4 to 1 that we saw for the U.S. as a whole in 2015 on one of those slides. Now, the national average for people over the age of 65 is in 2010 was 16%, and so our local area, this figure represents about 17.4% of the people in 2010 in this 4-county area were over the age of 65, so a little above the national average. According to the director of the Leisure Learning Program here at UWF, most of the members have at least a bachelor's degree and many have advanced degrees. Now, of our region's 140,000 plus senior citizens, 21,515 have at least a bachelor's degree and 16,622 have advanced or professional degrees. Now, here we see a comparison of the local catchment area for educational attainment of people over the age of 65 with the national averages. And this is all still from 2010. The local area is significantly under the national average for people over the age of 65 with at least a bachelor's degree, but significantly over the national average for people over the age of 65 with advanced or professional degrees. Now, the total membership of the Leisure Learning here at UWF is around 500, according to the director, and of those 500, 459 signed up for one or more classes in 2019. So that's pretty good participation. Sample selection will consist of invitations to those 500 members of the Leisure Learning community, and then self-selection as a participant, and then the assignment by the director of because I don't, as the researcher, I don't want to know who is participating. I just need the participants. So the director will be asked to assign the first 30 people who self-select to be research participants into the experimental group, and then up to 30 of the subsequent people who volunteer into the control group. A self-selection bias is anticipated because a real-world release of such an application of technology as an alternative way to select a set of courses would result in a self-selected group of users. Any random selection of participants into the experimental group might net a significant number of participants who would never have elected to use such technology given a choice. And so our results would not model the real world results of having made this application available. In other words, random selection of participants into the experimental group would incur the risk of producing a false representation of the feasibility of applying the technology in this instance. The data collection instruments will be the Perceived Mental Effort Rating Scale, adapted from PAWS in 1992. It will consist of a single question with 9 possible single select answers. The question will be, how would you describe the mental effort involved in selecting a set of courses for this semester? And the possible responses will range from 1, very, very little mental effort, up to 9, very high mental effort. Very, very high. Now, you can find all of these instruments in appendices in the actual paper in the committee share. The Likert type rating scale for course recommendations within the Scholastic web app, and we've just taken a look at that. You remember the smiley face and the laughing face. Now this instrument will only apply to the experimental group. They'll be the only ones with access to the web application. The UWF Course Satisfaction Survey, the Leisure Learning Center director has agreed to send this to all research participants along with the perceived mental effort rating scale question. Now the Leisure Learning program does not generally require a course satisfaction survey of its students, as do many other programs, but the director has agreed to request that the participants, the research participants, do fill one of these out. Research questions. Is there a significant difference in reported perceived mental effort involved in selecting courses for the semester between the experimental and control group? That is, do the people who use the web application to select their courses report less perceived cognitive load than do the people in the control group who will continue to use their traditional method of selecting a set of courses? How closely do the course recommendations made by the web application fit with the expectations of the student during the selection of a set of learning outcomes? Now, this question, we'll get the data to answer this question from those Likert type ratings that are in the web application. And is there a significant impact on reported course satisfaction? Does a comparison of the course satisfaction survey results between the experimental and control groups show any significant differences? Well, thank you, and I now would ask for questions and feedback, and for that we'll have to have that WebEx meeting scheduled, phase 2 of the defense, and we'll schedule that at the convenience of the committee just as soon as you've all had a chance to view this YouTube presentation as well as the supplementary video, and read through the paper, and hopefully sign into the Scholastic web application with that user account I provided, and get a feel for how it works and what you would like to see. If there's anything you think would work better, maybe just let me know, and that would be very helpful information. Thank you, and I hope to see you again soon.